Command & Conquer Tiberian Dawn is a real-time strategy game by Westwood Studios. This was released in 1995, which at the time was simply referred to as Command & Conquer. This is the first game to be released in the Command & Conquer franchise. Taking place in an alternate history, a strange resource known as Tiberium is slowly infecting the world. Two global factions are struggling for control of this new resource, the Global Defense Initiative of the United Nations and the quasi-cult referred to as the Brotherhood of Nod. It takes place from a top-down perspective. Here's how the game works. You build a base from which you operate from. Your mobile construction vehicle turns into a construction yard, which allows you to construct your various buildings. Some of these buildings allow you to train and build the units that will compose your army. The communication tower grants you access to the minimap, and refineries convert the harvested Tiberium to credits for purchasing new units and buildings. Power plants are used to power your buildings. If you do not generate enough power, your base will run at a reduced capacity. Your army is trained at a slower rate, you lose access to the minimap, and your high-tech base defenses will be disabled. It goes without saying, more power plants are better. All of these buildings are managed through the control panel on the right side of the screen. The construction options are organized in two columns and appear based on what structures you possess. You have the ability to repair structures through this control panel, which was different from other RTS games in that you did not have a worker unit that repaired structures over time. The building is slowly repaired, draining resources as it goes on. You also have the ability to sell structures. This returns 50% of a structure's value, which is sometimes necessary when you need the cash for extra units or simply to make room for something else. Harvesters are used to gather Tiberium spread across the map. These come free with a refinery, but you can also build them separately. They go out and harvest Tiberium automatically. Being the backbone of your economy, they require minimal attention, but are a valuable target for crippling a player's ability to fight. Now of course you need an army, that's the point of this game. Various infantry and vehicles will compose your fighting force. Units with machine guns will be more effective against infantry, while rockets and cannons are more useful against vehicles. The game takes on a rock-paper-scissors style of gameplay balance, which at the time was a new concept. Bazooka infantry, for example, are effective against tanks but weak against other infantry units, while Humvees and buggies are effective against infantry but weak against tanks. A larger army will still be able to overwhelm a smaller one, but an army with a mix of units will complement each other's strengths and compensate for each other's weaknesses. Engineers are a special infantry unit. They have no attack, but they can capture enemy buildings and give you access to its abilities. One interesting tactic is to send an APC with 5 engineers deep into the enemy base and capture the construction yard. Once in your possession, you can build static defenses around it to take out the enemy base or sell the structure for some quick cash. Either way, that cripples your opponent by preventing the construction of additional buildings. Air units in this game take on a more supportive role, functioning as surgical strike aircraft. They carry a limited payload and will need to rearm after their attack. Forces consisting of strictly air units are not viable simply because they have no staying power. Almost all of your forces will consist of ground units. Now here's something interesting. Once you build the required structures, you can build your faction's superweapon. The GDI has access to an orbital ion cannon, while Nod can launch nuclear missiles. These are very devastating weapons that can turn the tides when used at the right time. The single-player campaigns are approximately 15 missions for each faction. On some missions, you can actually choose an area to attack, though for the most part, it's the same objective with different terrain. You're given a mission briefing in full-motion video, which is a trend that carried over to subsequent Command & Conquer games. Commando Missions offer a change of pace from the normal army versus army gameplay. This single commando can take out an infantry unit in one shot. They can also run up to a building and destroy it with explosives. The challenge here is to avoid vehicles and base defenses, which the Commando is weak against. If you pay attention to the graphics, the pixelation will become very noticeable. While the game tries to have realistic proportions, the low resolution translates to many units being represented by only a handful of pixels. It can be especially difficult to distinguish between the various infantry units. This can potentially lead to confusion, issuing orders to attack the wrong unit. In layman's terms, the graphics suck. But it does try to add in some extra details to the scenery. Rockets and artillery leave craters on the ground they impact, and some missions do have villages with civilians walking around, and houses that look different from one another. The sound effects are awesome. The voice acting, the sound of cannons and machine gun fire, the explosions and screams of death, all of them are amazing. In all fairness though, this is expected from an RTS game. Good sound effects don't necessarily get praised as time goes on, but what does stand the test of time is the music. Frank Klepacki composed the music for most of the Command & Conquer games. It's a mix of heavy metal and industrial, and really drives up one's desire to play. The quality still ranks high today as it did in 1995. Since the initial success of Command & Conquer in 1995, the game was re-released for Windows called Command & Conquer Gold. It ran with a higher resolution to support a more detailed user interface, and also allowed you to see more of the battlefield. Multiplayer was probably the most prominent feature of the game, simply because it was rare at the time. Many developers never considered connecting real people together to play a game, and connection speeds between computers were extremely slow back then, especially for a real-time strategy game. Nonetheless, it was addictive for people lucky enough to play multiplayer. The Covert Operations expansion pack added 15 new single-player missions, as well as several music tracks and multiplayer maps. The single-player maps did not have FMV cutscenes, but they could be played in any order. Versions were also made for the game consoles. The Sega Saturn and PlayStation ports included the Covert Operations expansion and 5 exclusive missions. Aside from that, the game remained largely unchanged from the PC version. The Nintendo 64 port of the game does things differently. It updates some graphical elements with 3D models and 3D terrain, and has 4 exclusive missions referred to as special operations. Because of the space limitations with the Nintendo 64 cartridges, the FMV cutscenes were replaced with static images. As the real-time strategy genre evolved, so did the psychology behind playing it. These are the concepts of micro and macro management, which were unheard of back then. These deal with how well a player controls their forces and economy. A unit with low health is just as dangerous as one with full health. A player with good micromanagement will move units with low health to the back so they can continue doing damage, but the obsolete pathing system makes it difficult to perform. It's also much cheaper to repair an existing unit than it is to build a new one. A player with good macro management will have several refineries and harvesters in play to keep their income as high as possible, while keeping their cash reserves as low as possible by spending it on extra units that is needed to win the game. This concept makes Tiberium silos useless, because 8,000 in cash does nothing, but 8,000 worth of tanks can be used to overwhelm your opponent. I won't go too deep into RTS psychology, but it's interesting to see how it applies to an older game. Obviously, what we have here is a game that just kicks ass. After all, it did spawn a successful franchise in the real-time strategy genre. There were not many games on the market back in the day where you could move around troops and tanks in a virtual sandbox. This style of gameplay was reminiscent of the days where kids played with toy soldiers. And of course, you can squish infantry units with tanks. Command & Conquer was widely accepted as the game that popularized the real-time strategy genre. With its top-notch gameplay and features, the game is just emanating with innovation. EA Games now owns the Command & Conquer franchise. Like them or hate them, anything good they do should be noted. On the 12th anniversary of Command & Conquer's release, EA Games released the game as freeware. So if you haven't played this game yet, now's your chance!